The private gate camera flickered once at 6:42. Just once. Senior Royal Guard Elias Mercer stopped mid-step in the motorcade corridor. The feed restored immediately, showing the empty stone archway as expected. No alarm triggered. No dispatch call followed. But the timestamp skipped 4 seconds. Mercer stared at the frozen frame of the Princess's departure route. 4 seconds inside a secured perimeter should not exist. The engines were already running when Mercer raised his hand, and the vibration of idling motors moved through the courtyard stones into the soles of his boots as if the palace itself were waiting for permission to exhale. White security lights flattened the color from the vehicles and sharpened every edge, turning chrome into cold lines and windows into black mirrors. And inside the second car, the princess remained secured in her designated seat, with her protection officer beside her, unaware of the pause forming around her. Mercer's gaze did not leave the security console, where the private gate feed had stabilized into an image of still metal and undisturbed gravel, yet the system log beside it showed a 4-second interruption at 14:02:16, labeled as a minor signal fluctuation. No breach alert, no escalation flag, nothing that formally required intervention. And the supervising operations officer, coat collar lifted against the thin winter wind, stepped closer with controlled restraint in his posture and asked whether there was an issue because the public timetable had already been distributed and external units were in synchronized position beyond the outer perimeter. Mercer answered without raising his voice that there had been a 4-second camera loss at the private gate, and the officer glanced at the log and replied that the system had restored itself and indicated no intrusion, which was procedurally correct, technically sufficient, and institutionally convenient. But Mercer had spent enough years studying quiet perimeters to distrust silence that corrected itself too quickly, because real malfunctions left residue, pixel distortion, delayed stabilization, a stagger in frame rate, whereas this interruption ended cleanly on an exact second mark. He zoomed the playback and watched the moment the feed dissolved into digital noise and returned precisely 4 seconds later with no shift in light or shadow, as if the world beyond the gate had paused and resumed on command. And he felt that small internal tightening that came not from fear but from pattern recognition, the disciplined instinct formed from repetition, telling him that irregularity often hides inside normalcy. The officer reminded him that protocol required continuation absent confirmed threat, and that freezing the motorcade would require written justification, yet Mercer kept his hand raised toward the drivers, holding them in suspension, because the interruption had occurred during the most vulnerable transition window, when outer barriers adjusted and attention split between interior and exterior control. And though 4 seconds could be meaningless, they could also be enough for someone who understood timing. He watched the monitor again, noting how still the gravel appeared beneath the gate's shadow, how the afternoon light struck the metal without variation, and he considered the difference between trusting a system designed to reassure and trusting the discipline built from years of guarding a child who did not choose the risks assigned to her name. And he knew that lowering his hand would allow the convoy to move exactly on schedule, clean and efficient, while raising further objection would challenge hierarchy in full view of assembled staff. And in that narrow space between decision and obedience, the engines continued to hum, waiting for him to decide whether 4 missing seconds were nothing or something deliberately placed there. Mercer lowered his hand only long enough to step closer to the console, isolating the gate feed and requesting a frame-by-frame replay while the courtyard air cooled against his face and the engines maintained their restrained vibration behind him. and he could sense the impatience building, not through raised voices, but through stillness. The drivers holding the wheel at ready position, the escort commander glancing once at his watch, the operations officer shifting weight, but saying nothing further. The replay confirmed the interruption's precision, 4 seconds removed without degradation before or after, and Mercer requested the secondary angle covering the interior approach to the gate, which showed no pedestrian movement and no vehicle presence. Yet he noticed something else. During the second preceding the signal loss, the exposure levels adjusted slightly, as if compensating for a brief obstruction, not enough to trigger automated detection, but enough for a trained eye to register. He asked the control technician whether any maintenance had been logged on the gate camera within the past 24 hours, and the technician answered that none had been scheduled and no diagnostic alerts had been issued, and the operations officer interjected that environmental interference occasionally caused short signal compression, and that delaying a protected movement without confirmed anomaly would create unnecessary attention beyond the walls. Mercer understood the broader consequences: media speculation about departure delays, questions from administrative offices, documentation reviews, but his responsibility narrowed to a single fact. The princess would exit through that gate within minutes, and the only unknown variable in the entire chain were those missing seconds. He ordered a temporary hold on remote gate activation and requested that the outer sentry at the private gate provide immediate visual confirmation of hinge integrity and ground disturbance, and the radio crackled with acknowledgement, though the pause that followed was longer than usual, not resistant but surprised. The operations officer's voice hardened slightly as he reminded Mercer that halting departure required notation of specific threat indicators, and Mercer responded that unexplained signal manipulation during a controlled exit window constituted sufficient irregularity for manual verification under protective discretion, keeping his tone even, not argumentative, because escalation through volume would weaken rather than strengthen his position. Across the courtyard, a faint movement caught his attention as a junior guard near the archway shifted stance to maintain line of sight toward the gate corridor, mirroring Mercer's focus without instruction. And the air seemed thinner now, the earlier routine replaced by suspended expectation. The radio finally responded that the gate appeared secure from the exterior position, no visible tampering, no forced entry marks, yet Mercer did not release the hold, because appearance from a distance rarely revealed intention, and he instructed the sentry to remain in place while he authorized a closer internal inspection before any vehicle moved. And in that moment the tension settled not into panic, but into administrative resistance, the kind that accumulates quietly when one man's caution interrupts a schedule designed to function without deviation. And Mercer stood between the humming engines and the closed gate, aware that continuing forward would restore order instantly, while insisting on inspection would challenge the assumption that the system could not be wrong. And he chose not to move the convoy, allowing the silence to lengthen until procedure itself felt uncertain. The courtyard remained sealed, engines subdued to a lower idle on Mercer's instruction, exhaust vapor drifting in thin white ribbons beneath the floodlights, while the princess waited inside the secured vehicle, insulated from the tension accumulating outside by layered glass and controlled climate. Mercer stepped away from the console only when the senior palace administrator entered the courtyard from the colonnade, coat unbuttoned despite the cold, expression composed but sharpened by disruption, and the staff around them adjusted subtly, posture tightening as hierarchy reasserted itself. The administrator did not raise his voice, nor did he need to, because authority in the palace rarely announced itself loudly. It simply occupied space and expected alignment. and he asked Mercer for clarification regarding the delay with a tone that implied the answer should be brief and procedural. Mercer explained the 4-second interruption at the private gate camera during the pre-departure window and his decision to suspend remote activation pending manual verification, presenting the facts without embellishment, aware that precision was his only defense. The administrator listened, then glanced toward the convoy, noting that external police units had already synchronized their escort pattern and that the public schedule left little tolerance for deviation. And he stated that no breach alert had been issued, no forced entry recorded, and no anomaly confirmed beyond a transient signal fluctuation categorized by the system as negligible. Mercer acknowledged that assessment, yet reiterated that the interruption occurred at the exact transition window when the gate would have been most vulnerable, and that clean signal loss without residual distortion suggested controlled interference rather than random malfunction. And though he did not frame it as accusation, the implications settled between them. The administrator reminded him that freezing a royal movement without verified threat constituted procedural overreach and could trigger internal review of command judgment. And Mercer felt the weight of that statement not as intimidation but as institutional reality, because the palace relied on layered trust in systems, in hierarchy, in trained personnel, and challenging one layer disturbed the entire structure. Still, he requested authorization for a manual perimeter sweep of the gate interior and exterior before departure, emphasizing that the princess remained secured and that a 5-minute verification would either confirm safety or reveal vulnerability before exposure beyond palace walls. The administrator paused, calculating optics, liability, and precedent, and finally granted provisional approval for a rapid sweep with the clear expectation that the convoy would depart immediately upon confirmation of normal conditions. And Mercer inclined his head once in acknowledgement before issuing quiet radio instructions for 2 guards to reposition toward the private gate corridor, knowing that each additional minute increased administrative pressure while decreasing tolerance for uncertainty. And as he watched the guards move with disciplined efficiency through the archway, he understood that he had shifted from cautious observer to accountable decision-maker, and there would be no neutral outcome if the inspection returned nothing. Mercer walked toward the inner corridor leading to the private gate, boots striking the stone with measured cadence, the temperature dropping slightly as he passed from open courtyard into the shaded passage where sound narrowed and every footstep echoed against the vaulted ceiling. The junior guards assigned to the sweep awaited him near the security threshold, their expressions composed yet alert, and he briefed them concisely. Visual inspection of hinge mounts, ground compression patterns, sensor casing alignment, no assumptions, no shortcuts, before authorizing the gate's mechanical lockdown to prevent remote cycling during inspection. Behind him, through layered stone and distance, he could still sense the presence of the stationary convoy, the princess seated within a paused departure that she would later remember only as a slight delay. And that awareness sharpened his focus, because vulnerability during transition was never dramatic, it was administrative, buried inside routine. His radio crackled with a controlled inquiry from the administrator, requesting time remaining, and Mercer responded that inspection was in progress and would conclude shortly, keeping his tone steady, neither defensive nor apologetic. As he reached the final bend in the corridor where the private gate came into view beneath angled afternoon light. At first glance it appeared undisturbed, iron panels closed flush, locking bolts seated, gravel path beyond resting in even texture, and one of the junior guards reported no visible tampering from his position near the exterior threshold. But Mercer did not rely on overview impressions, instead stepping closer to the ground where light met shadow along the service wall. The air here felt stiller, less circulated than the courtyard, carrying a faint metallic scent from the gate's hinges, and he crouched slightly, scanning the gravel for pattern disruption rather than obvious marks, because intrusion often left absence rather than imprint. He noted that the sensor casing mounted along the interior frame sat marginally askew, not enough to trigger a system alert, but sufficient to disturb his internal alignment with what normal should look like, and he ran his gloved fingers lightly along the edge without applying pressure, confirming that one fastening screw bore a recent tool impression, cleaner than surrounding weathered metal. The junior guard shifted closer, noticing Mercer's focus, and asked whether it required escalation, and Mercer answered that it required documentation and isolation before any vehicle moved through, because if the casing had been adjusted during those missing 4 seconds, then the interruption was not environmental but deliberate. Behind them, faint through the corridor, came the muted echo of a vehicle engine revving momentarily before settling again, a reminder that patience outside was thinning, and Mercer straightened slowly, eyes fixed on the slightly misaligned sensor, aware that what he was seeing was not yet proof of threat, but unmistakably evidence of human interference. And he understood that reporting this would transform administrative skepticism into formal inquiry, and that his decision to halt the motorcade had just crossed from precaution into confrontation with someone holding authorized access within the palace walls. Mercer did not speak immediately after standing. He let the silence settle around the gate, as if the metal itself might offer explanation if observed long enough, and the junior guard beside him remained still, waiting for instruction without pressing for interpretation. The afternoon light angled through the corridor opening and struck the gravel at a shallow degree, revealing subtle variations in texture that would disappear under direct overhead illumination, and Mercer stepped beyond the threshold to examine the narrow strip of ground running parallel to the service wall where maintenance staff occasionally passed during scheduled repairs. At first glance, the gravel appeared evenly distributed, pale stones flattened by routine foot traffic, but he lowered his gaze closer to the surface and noted 2 faint compression patterns, not deep impressions and not shaped clearly enough to assign footwear, yet recent enough that the edges had not settled back into natural scatter. He measured the distance between them with his eyes, calculating stride length without drawing a ruler, and the spacing suggested a cautious step rather than hurried movement, the kind taken by someone aware that cameras were present even if briefly inactive. The junior guard reported again that no visible breach was apparent along the gate's external face, and Mercer nodded but remained focused on the sensor casing, because its slight misalignment carried greater significance than the gravel. He requested a handheld diagnostic device from the corridor locker and ran a passive scan along the casing seam without opening it, confirming that the internal circuitry responded normally to system queries, which meant any interference had been temporary and deliberately timed rather than permanently disabling. His radio vibrated softly against his vest with an inquiry from the senior administrator requesting status confirmation, and Mercer replied that irregular physical indicators were present and that he required an additional 3 minutes for documentation before clearing the route, choosing his words carefully to avoid premature accusation. Behind him, the junior guard shifted his stance to maintain watch toward the outer courtyard, and Mercer sensed the widening implication of what they were observing, because gravel does not compress itself and sensor casings do not rotate without contact. He crouched again, this time using a small evidence marker from his utility pouch to discreetly outline the compression area for later forensic photography, careful not to disturb the stones beyond necessity. And as he worked, he felt the transition from suspicion to confirmation unfolding quietly, not dramatic but precise. He understood that the interruption of 4 seconds aligned almost exactly with the time required to adjust a sensor bracket and test alignment without triggering a full system alert, and that whoever performed the adjustment possessed both technical knowledge and authorized access to approach the gate without immediate challenge. When he rose once more, the air felt colder along the corridor, not from temperature shift, but from awareness, and he informed control to freeze all internal maintenance terminal access pending review, a measure that would ripple through administrative channels instantly. The junior guard looked at him, comprehension settling without alarm, and Mercer recognized that the situation had shifted from possible external intrusion to potential internal manipulation, and that distinction carried weight far heavier than any physical breach because it implied trust exploited rather than perimeter tested. The response from Central Control came within seconds, tighter than before, asking for clarification regarding the freeze order, and Mercer stated plainly that physical indicators at the private gate suggested deliberate sensor adjustment during the documented camera interruption, and that further remote access to gate systems must be suspended until verified secure. And though his tone remained even, he knew the order would escalate beyond routine chain of command. The senior administrator arrived at the corridor entrance moments later, footsteps echoing sharply against stone, and stopped short of the threshold as if unwilling to cross into the zone now marked as irregular. Mercer briefed him concisely, indicating the compression marks and the misaligned casing without speculation, presenting evidence rather than theory, and the administrator's gaze hardened not in anger but in calculation as he processed the implications of authorized misuse. He asked whether the indicators could have resulted from legitimate maintenance earlier in the week, and Mercer replied that maintenance logs reflected no scheduled adjustments and that the screw head bore a fresh tool impression inconsistent with routine inspection, and he offered to provide photographic documentation immediately. Silence followed, broken only by the faint hum of electrical systems inside the wall, and beyond the corridor, the engines in the courtyard dropped to a deeper idle as drivers awaited instruction. The administrator requested confirmation that the princess remained secured and uninformed of the delay, and Mercer confirmed that the interior protection officer had reported no irregularity within the vehicle cabin, and that the princess was reading quietly, unaware of procedural tension unfolding meters away. This detail seemed to steady the administrator momentarily, because the core objective, her safety, remained intact, yet the cost of continued delay increased with every passing minute. Mercer then requested authorization to review internal maintenance terminal logs from the preceding hour, specifying that any override command corresponding to the 4-second window must be identified before the gate could be cleared for use, and this request crossed from perimeter inspection into administrative territory, challenging not just a physical anomaly, but the integrity of internal access control. The administrator hesitated, aware that granting such review without higher approval risked exposing sensitive clearance records, but denying it would require him to accept the possibility of manipulated security beneath his authority. After a measured pause, he authorized temporary investigative access under Mercer's supervision, instructing him to document every action for formal report. Mercer inclined his head once, signaling acknowledgment rather than triumph, because he understood that the discovery of internal override would not end with procedural correction, but would initiate inquiry into individuals whose credentials granted them proximity to the princess's movement schedule. As he transmitted the request to Control for terminal access logs, he glanced once more at the gate, at the subtle shift in metal alignment and the faint gravel compression that had nearly gone unnoticed, and he felt neither satisfaction nor alarm, only the steady confirmation that instinct had been correct to pause the motorcade, and that the real breach was not an open gate, but a manipulated second hidden within an otherwise flawless system. And somewhere within the palace network, a terminal had recorded that decision in digital silence.
The maintenance terminal logs arrived as encrypted data packets routed through central control, and Mercer reviewed them on the secured tablet while standing in the corridor outside the private gate, the cold stone at his back anchoring him as the courtyard beyond remained suspended in procedural stillness. The log sequence showed routine system pings, temperature calibrations, and scheduled diagnostics until 14:02:14, when a manual override command was entered under senior maintenance clearance, lasting precisely 4 seconds before reverting to standard operational mode. And Mercer felt the quiet shift from uncertainty to defined breach because the timestamp aligned exactly with the camera interruption he had observed. The override did not open the gate, nor did it disengage full locking mechanisms, but it temporarily suppressed sensor feedback, enough to test response timing without triggering alarm thresholds. He requested identity authentication tied to the clearance code, and Control responded after a brief delay that the credentials belonged to a contracted facilities engineer assigned to rotational infrastructure maintenance, authorized for internal systems but not for live security windows during royal movement. The senior administrator stood beside him now, reading the same data over Mercer's shoulder, and his silence carried more gravity than earlier impatience, because the misuse was not hypothetical, it was recorded. Mercer asked whether the engineer was currently on palace grounds, and confirmation came that he had logged entry that morning for routine electrical inspection in a separate wing, with no scheduled task near the private gate. The princess remained seated in the stationary vehicle, unaware that her departure route had become the center of an internal containment operation, and Mercer issued a quiet order for the convoy to remain locked down until further notice, accepting the administrative consequences that would follow. The administrator contacted internal compliance discreetly, requesting immediate location verification of the engineer without alerting broader staff. And Mercer sensed the careful balance being maintained. Avoid panic, avoid spectacle, isolate quietly. He reviewed the override parameters again, noting that the engineer had accessed the system from a terminal within the lower maintenance corridor 2 levels below their current position, and that the override window had been executed with technical precision rather than exploratory error. Mercer imagined the sequence: approach terminal, input credentials, suppress sensor feedback, confirm timing, restore system, and step away, leaving only 4 missing seconds behind. He understood that this was not an impulsive act, but a measured test of vulnerability during the most sensitive phase of a child's protected movement. When compliance reported that the engineer was no longer present at his assigned inspection site and had not badged out through main exits, the temperature in the corridor seemed to drop further, and Mercer's next instruction came without hesitation: seal internal maintenance corridors, restrict badge egress, and maintain silent containment until the individual was located, because the threat was no longer theoretical misjudgment, but calculated opportunity within palace walls. Security units moved without visible alarm, repositioning along interior corridors in patterns indistinguishable from routine patrol to anyone not aware of the containment directive, and Mercer returned briefly to the courtyard to reassure the interior protection officer that departure remained suspended for technical verification, offering no details beyond necessity. Through the tinted glass, he saw the princess leaning slightly toward the window, curious about the delay, yet composed, her gloved hands resting calmly in her lap, and he gave a small nod to the officer inside, signaling that protective posture remained unchanged. The engines were powered down fully now, eliminating vibration and reducing external attention, and the courtyard settled into a controlled quiet that masked the tightening search unfolding beneath the palace floors. Mercer rejoined the administrator in the corridor, where compliance officers reported that the engineer's badge had last pinged near the lower service stairwell leading toward the east exit, a route seldom used during public-facing operations. CCTV feeds from that corridor displayed the engineer walking at an even pace approximately 2 minutes after the override window, carrying a standard tool case, posture unhurried, expression neutral. Mercer watched the footage carefully, noting that the man paused briefly near a secondary control panel as if confirming restoration before proceeding, and that small hesitation suggested awareness rather than accident. The administrator asked whether this constituted hostile intent or misguided testing, and Mercer responded that motive could be determined later, but opportunity exploited during a protected movement created unacceptable exposure regardless of intent. He instructed security to intercept the engineer discreetly at the East Corridor junction before any exit could be attempted, emphasizing calm engagement without escalation unless resistance occurred. Moments later, confirmation arrived that the individual had been located and detained for questioning in a controlled environment within the lower wing, cooperative but visibly unsettled. Mercer did not accompany the initial questioning, remaining instead at the gate to supervise restoration of full sensor calibration and verify that no secondary manipulation devices had been installed within the casing. Technicians carefully removed the misaligned bracket under his observation, confirming that the adjustment had been minor but deliberate, designed to test detection latency rather than disable protection outright. When calibration returned to optimal alignment and all override pathways were temporarily suspended pending investigation, Mercer finally authorized preparatory sequence for departure, though he insisted on a fresh system integrity check before any remote activation. As the convoy engines restarted and the courtyard lights reflected again on polished surfaces, the administrator stood beside him in measured silence, and neither man acknowledged the tension that had nearly pushed procedure ahead of instinct. The gate opened smoothly under verified control, and Mercer watched every hinge movement, every shift of gravel beneath tire weight, ensuring that this time no second went unaccounted for, and only when the final vehicle cleared the threshold did he allow himself a single steady breath, aware that the true breach had not been force against iron, but calculation within authority, and that protecting a child sometimes required pausing an entire institution long enough to see what others preferred not to notice.
The motorcade moved without ceremony once clearance was restored, tires compressing the gravel in controlled arcs as the private gate closed behind the final vehicle with a measured mechanical thud, and Mercer remained at the threshold until the locking bolts seated fully and the sensor panel confirmed uninterrupted feed stability. The courtyard gradually resumed its natural rhythm, support staff dispersing, outer units adjusting formation beyond palace grounds. Yet the internal containment operation continued beneath that surface normalcy, and Mercer transitioned from immediate perimeter oversight to controlled follow-through. The detained engineer had been escorted to a secure administrative room within the lower wing, cooperative but increasingly aware of the gravity of the situation, and Mercer reviewed preliminary questioning notes before entering, preferring to understand tone and sequence rather than confront without context. The report indicated that the engineer admitted accessing the maintenance terminal, but claimed the override was a response test, an attempt to measure system resilience during live conditions to demonstrate efficiency improvements for contract renewal review. And Mercer paused at that phrasing because it revealed something more subtle than sabotage. It revealed ambition layered over access. Inside the room, the engineer sat upright, hands visible on the table,
tool case placed against the wall, postured defensive but not defiant, and Mercer observed him in silence for several seconds before taking a seat opposite, allowing the quiet to emphasize the imbalance between authorized protection and misused clearance. He asked only factual questions: who authorized the live test, why no written proposal existed, why the timing aligned precisely with a protected departure window. And the engineer responded that he believed brief suppression would go unnoticed, and that no actual breach was intended. Mercer noted that the system had indeed recorded the override, but categorized it as minor fluctuation, which meant the engineer understood threshold tolerances well enough to exploit them without triggering alarm. Outside the room, compliance officers documented every exchange, and the senior administrator observed through secured glass, his earlier impatience replaced by restrained concern. Mercer did not accuse or threaten, instead outlining calmly that suppressing sensor feedback during a child's protected transition created exposure regardless of outcome, and that protocol was not theoretical. It existed precisely to prevent experimentation during vulnerability. The engineer's composure began to thin, not from aggression but from realization, as he understood that his attempt to showcase technical initiative had intersected with the movement of a royal child whose safety depended on predictable systems. Mercer concluded the questioning phase by instructing compliance to suspend the engineer's access credentials pending full investigation and to secure all maintenance terminals under dual authorization requirement until further notice. And as he stepped back into the corridor, the air felt steadier, though not lighter, because resolution of immediate threat did not erase the institutional lesson unfolding quietly within palace walls. By the time Mercer returned to the private gate corridor, the late afternoon light had shifted toward dusk, softening the hard angles of stone and casting longer shadows along the service wall where the faint compression marks had nearly gone unnoticed. Technicians had completed recalibration, and a secondary audit confirmed that no additional overrides were embedded within the system code. Yet Mercer requested one more manual cycle of the gate without convoy presence, watching the hinges move and settle, while studying the live feed for any micro-distortion that might suggest hidden latency. Everything functioned cleanly now, precise and transparent, and the absence of irregularity felt earned rather than assumed. The senior administrator joined him once more, posture less rigid than earlier, and informed him that King Charles had been briefed discreetly on the incident and had ordered a formal review of live window access permissions across all sensitive routes, not as reprimand but as structural correction. Mercer acknowledged the directive without expression, understanding that the review validated his decision while also formalizing scrutiny of everyone involved, himself included. Administrative consequence would follow, reports, timelines, performance evaluations, but none of that altered the essential outcome. The princess's departure occurred without exposure because 4 missing seconds had been treated as meaningful rather than negligible. In the quiet that followed, Mercer walked once more along the gravel edge, now disturbed by documented evidence markers and technicians' prints, and he considered how easily the override could have remained undiscovered had he trusted the automated categorization. Protocol existed to guide actions, but instinct, honed through repetition, responsibility, and proximity to vulnerability, served as the final filter when systems simplified irregularity into acceptable noise. As dusk settled fully and the palace lights adjusted to evening mode, Mercer transmitted final confirmation that the private gate was restored to secure status under enhanced authorization parameters, and he removed the temporary freeze on movement protocols. The courtyard, now empty of vehicles, reflected a calm that concealed the quiet confrontation between procedure and conscience that had unfolded hours earlier. And Mercer understood that protection was rarely dramatic. It was the discipline to pause when everything urged continuation. Somewhere beyond the walls, the princess's convoy merged into scheduled engagements, unaware that her safety had hinged on 4 seconds examined rather than dismissed. and Mercer remained at his post as night took hold, steady in the knowledge that instinct, when disciplined by duty, was not a violation of protocol, but its necessary safeguard.